Okay, on to part two here, where we will go over what can happen with too much arousal in certain scenarios. And so, specifically, we'll talk about test anxiety and choking. So, first of all, one of the theories in this field is processing efficiency theory. Um, Theories on this topic, kind of in general, differ from the first lecture a bit in terms of these theories, such as processing efficiency theory, argue that high levels of arousal are accompanied by negative thinking and expectations. And so this is distracting. In other words, it takes up cognitive resources that otherwise could be used on the actual task at hand. And so a bit of an easy example of this is math anxiety. And so think about if you're taking a math test and you have to answer multiple problems based on math that aren't easy. So these are pretty difficult problems that take up, a lot of cognitive resources to do. If you have this test anxiety or too much arousal that leads to negative thinking and expectations, that's going to take up the resources that you need for the math test. And then it's reasonable to assume that your performance on this test will be worse because you don't have your full cognitive resources that you need or would want when taking this test. And so, specific to processing efficiency theory, the idea is that test anxiety reduces working memory speed. And so that's what we're seeing here in these charts on the right is from a study based on a go or no go task, which is basically just usually for these tasks, you're looking at a screen and when you get some sort of signal or you see something on this screen, you click a button. However, sometimes you also get signaled that on this trial you're not supposed to do anything, you're not supposed to press the button. That usually comes in the form of some sort of sound. But anyways, we have, you can see this line here is going to be for high trait anxiety or anxiousness, and then low trait anxiousness. And in this chart on the left, we have response time. The chart on the right, we have accuracy. As you can see, the accuracy doesn't really seem to change based on trait anxiousness. Throughout, as the task gets more difficult, then accuracy also decreases for the most part. But between groups there, between the anxiousness groups, it's relatively similar. However, as hypothesized with processing efficiency here, where you see differences is with response time. And so you can see that there's a much higher response time for this high trait anxiousness group relative to the low trait anxiousness group for all levels of task difficulty, although that difference seems to increase a bit as the task gets more difficult. And so the idea is that for those high in trait anxiety, this anxiousness and kind of negative thinking or expectations is taking up those resources. And this then therefore decreases that working memory speed. And so even though accuracy is still relatively the same, this can still be important when you think about timed tests, whether that's in classes or the SAT or GRE or whatever. Even if you end up at the correct answer, the same amount, you're not going to get through as many questions in a timed test. And so therefore your score is going to be worse. Now getting to some different choking topics. This is most commonly seen in athletic events or sports scenarios. So this is just a video that you can go watch if you'd like. It's definitely not required, but it's basically just a video of different sports, classic choking in sports. And so if you're a sports fan, it's kind of brutal to watch that. But anyways, choking in sports typically happens when there is a lot of pressure on that specific event or game. And so, yeah, typically happens when teams are under a lot of pressure. Oftentimes, this pressure comes from fans, obviously, as we saw from the previous studies about giving, speeches in front of others. That's anxiety provoking and very arousing, stressful. And so is playing sports in front of fans. That definitely increases arousal, especially in important games, which is what we're seeing here. So typically in sports, it's a real thing that there is home court or home field advantage. However, this seems to either decrease or flip in high pressure games. The idea being that with so much pressure already on the game, the pressure from that home crowd adds a bit too much to get more arousal than is wanted for optimal performance. And so this top table here, this is basketball, so free throw performance, and then a playoff series. So in games 1 through 4, free throw shooting appears to be about the same. However, in the final game of the series, the home team turns out to have a worse free throw shooting percentage. You see a more extreme version of that here in this table, which is about baseball and World Series games. So in games 1 and 2, you see that it's less common for the home team to make errors. However, that completely switches in game 7. The home team actually then ends up making more errors. And the idea is just that the combination of pressures is too much. And that leads to things like missing free throws that you practice all the time and making unforced errors. Those are kind of measures of choking. Again, kind of a similar idea here. Sorry, move me. This is just an example of soccer. So penalty shots in soccer. There are kind of few different types of scenarios that can occur with penalty shots in soccer. So there can be negative shots where you're playing not to lose. And so this just means that if you're the one kicking that penalty shot and you miss, you lose the game. There's neutral, where you just won't win or lose based on if you make that shot. And then positive is where your team is, up by a penalty shot or 2. And if you make one more, you win. And so we see that the pressure from these negative shots is too much, and that there's kind of an interaction between arousal, because just arousal with penalty shots in general is going to be high, but that seems to interact a bit with thought processes and how that pressure situation is perceived, and whether it's perceived as, oh, I can't lose here, or whether it's perceived as I want to make this to win. Because as you can see, the percentage of goals in these penalty shots is a lot higher for those positive shots than the negative shots. Finally here, your book talks about this, and I just want to briefly introduce this in lecture. The Cuff catastrophe model. This also stems from a sports perspective, and I just want to bring this up because it makes an important distinguishment between cognitive anxiety and physiological arousal, and how there can be an interaction between these two things that can provide what they call the cusp, which was the area that you want to be in for optimal arousal. So, and to get your best performance. So basically the idea is that there is X amount of cognitive anxiety. When you have this amount of cognitive anxiety, you also want to have X amount of physiological arousal, and this combination will lead to the best performance. However, when arousal surpasses that cusp, that's when you see things like in sports choking, or in this theory, they also talk about freezing, or what they call tonic immobility. And so their idea is just that this has evolved, and so it's something that is still to this day adaptive for animals. If you think about certain I guess rodents that are trying to run away from predators such as hawks, sometimes if they freeze, that predator will lose interest, and so the rodent will survive another day. So therefore, obviously that's adaptive, and the idea for humans then just stems from, again, kind of going back to the evolutionary theories we talked about in the very beginning, where the idea is that at one point, even if it might typically not be adaptive for humans now, although in some scenarios it certainly could be, the idea is that humans were at one point in time prey as well, and so this was also adaptive for humans. So that's it for this video. We'll get into the final arousal topic next, which is eustress.